everyone, and welcome to this video tutorial in which we're looking at a negligence exam question, and we're looking at a little scenario, the type of which could come up on your tort A-level paper. So let's start by considering the facts that we've been given. So Lucy's just passed her driving test and is delighted with her new car. She offers to take her neighbour, Bina, to the supermarket. When leaving the supermarket, Lucy puts the car into reverse gear by mistake. Lucy crashes the car into a lamppost behind her, and Bina suffers a whiplash neck injury and has to take 6 weeks off work. And you're being asked to advise Lucy whether she's liable for Bina's injuries in tort. So to answer this question, you would need to apply your knowledge of negligence. So we're going to start to take a look at what steps you need to take to maximise your chances of getting full marks on this question. So before we consider the answer to this question, it's useful just to remind yourself of the 3 elements that we will need to prove in order to find Lucy liable in negligence for Bina's injury. Remember that I do have other videos on my channel that go through all of the law on negligence, on duty, breach and damage. So if you need a refresher on these areas, do have a look for those videos. But just briefly then, we're going to need to establish first of all whether Lucy owes a duty, whether we think she has breached that duty, i.e. she's fallen below the standard expected of the reasonable man, and whether we can say that she is responsible in law for causing the damage by proving factual causation and remoteness of damage. Whenever you're looking at a scenario, you should go through sort of a mental checklist in your mind on this. You need to look at the scenario and think to yourself, was it reasonably foreseeable? Was there proximity? Is it fair, just and reasonable to impose this duty on our defendant? Are there any special characteristics involved that would alter the standard of care that we would expect for breach of duty? Are there any risk factors? And do we think that our defendant has caused the damage? Have they met the but-for test? Are there any remoteness issues involved? And it's useful to go through your scenario with a highlighter and highlight looking for these particular elements. And then you're going to need to go through a step-by-step answer using that idea formulation. So we need to identify our defendant and our claimant. We need to define the tort that we're explaining. We need to explain that tort using lots of cases, and we need to apply it back to the characters in our scenario. So you can see on this slide, I've highlighted the steps to getting a good answer: the identification, the definition, the explanation, and the application. So the first thing to say is that Lucy might be liable in the tort of negligence for Bina's injury. And although you might already be thinking in your head, yep, I know she's going to be liable, it's good practice in the exam to say that your defendant might be liable at this stage. And obviously you're going to work through and show your workings before you reach a solid conclusion at the end. So we now need to define this tort of negligence that we've identified in step 1. And we can say that 3 things need to be proven for Lucy to be liable in negligence. Firstly, she owed a duty of care to Bina. Secondly, that she's breached this duty. And finally, that the breach can be said to have caused the damage. So we're going to explain those 3 things. So your definition almost acts as like an essay plan for what's coming next. So we need to explain duty of care. So I've got duty of care here, and I would explain it using these cases. And then you can see I've got breach, and I would explain it using these cases. And then I've got damage and my explanation with the cases here. Now, for the purposes of this video, I've completely separated my E, my explanation, from my application, my A, that I've put at the end. And when you first start out applying law, this is the easiest way to do it. However, in the exam, it's better really if you were to explain all of duty of care and then apply duty of care to the scenario. Explain breach and then apply breach to your scenario. And by doing it that way, you're less likely to run out of time and miss out all of your application. And it also just flows better for the person answering. So in essence, what you would really have is I, D, E, A, E, A, E, A, if that makes sense. You explain it, you apply it, you explain it, you apply it. But as I've said, I've chunked it for you on this video so you can clearly see all of the explanation of the law and all of the application that you would need to do. So for duty of care, you'd be talking about Donahue and Stevenson, of course, and the Caparo three-stage test, and whether it's reasonably foreseeable, proximate, and whether it's fair, just and reasonable in the circumstances to impose a duty, with that key case of Robinson in there as well. In terms of breach, you're talking about whether it can be said that your defendant has breached the standard of the reasonable man, which comes from Blythe and Birmingham Waterworks. And your character's often going to argue, well, I've not been doing it very long, I'm a learner, I should owe less of a standard than an experienced person. But of course, you're going to be applying the case of Nettleship and Weston on that. And in terms of damage, this is often what's quite tricky to prove, particularly in medical negligence cases. You need to show that your defendant meets factual causation. So they've met the but-for test from Barnet and Chelsea Kensington Hospital, and that also the damage was not too remote, using the case of the wagon mound. So in terms of application then, we're going to start by considering whether Lucy owes a duty of care. And again, this E, your explanation, acts as a checklist really for all the steps you need to apply. So first of all, I would say that Lucy owes a duty of care because it is reasonably foreseeable. So we can say that Lucy is spatially proximate to Bina because Bina is in the same car as her. And you could also say, when you're talking about reasonably foreseeable, that using these cases here, that it's reasonably foreseeable that if you put the car into the wrong gear and you don't check what your gear you're going into and you don't look in your mirrors, it's reasonably foreseeable that you might crash into something behind you. In terms of proximity, she is, obviously I've mentioned, she's proximate to Bina because Bina is her passenger, so she meets that requirement. And in terms of it being fair, just and reasonable, we can say it is going to be fair, just and reasonable to impose a duty on Lucy because she's not a public service acting in an emergency. And you will get on to talking about breach, whether it can be said that Lucy's breached her duty. And we always start off with the standard of the reasonable man, Blythe and Birmingham Waterworks. But Lucy's going to argue, oh, well, I've not been driving long, I've only just passed. However, we're going to apply the case of Nettleship and Weston here and say that it's actually irrelevant that Lucy's a new driver. She's going to be expected to reach the same level of competence as an experienced driver, so that will be irrelevant. We can also say that she has breached the duty by not checking what gear that she's put the car into, and you could say that a reasonable person, particularly someone who's just passed their test, would be checking that. And in terms of risk factors involved, you can say that it's high risk not to be checking your gears. It's going to take little effort to check what you're doing, so you could apply the case of Paris there as well. And in terms of causation, it seems that factual causation is met because but for Lucy putting the car into reverse when she didn't mean to, Bina wouldn't have been hurt. There's no multiple causes like in the case of Wilshire. You know, there's no other possible explanation for Bina's whiplash other than this particular incident. and the damage is not too remote. And you talk about the fact that whiplash is not a remote injury from crashing in a car. And you could talk about even extreme forms of expected damage are recoverable. You could use the case of Bradford there. So even if Bina's whiplash was quite extreme in terms of how significant it was for her, it's still going to be recoverable. So you'd be concluding by saying that Lucy's met the 3 different elements for negligence. So Bina is going to be able to claim pecuniary damages for her injury. Although on this slide I do want to point out my answer is very bullet pointy, so I could fit it all on here for you. Obviously in the exam you need to be writing in full sentences, and you need to be outlining briefly what's happened or the principles from the key cases, so that you can show the examiner that you really understand these principles. So I hope this video has been useful to you. If it has, please like it and subscribe to my channel if you've not already, because that helps me to make more content for you. And do have a look at my other playlists on negligence, so you can see whether there's any other videos that be of use to you on this topic.